Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yuan. In the oil-rich South American country of Venezuela, President Maduro has announced a 60-day emergency, giving soldiers and police wide powers to deal with the country's spiraling economic crises. Well, the decree was rejected by the opposition-held National Assembly late on Tuesday. But Mr. Maduro has indicated that he will not abide by their decision. Meanwhile, China has confirmed that it is willing to continue to strengthen financial cooperation with Venezuela, after media reports said the two countries had reached an agreement to change the conditions for an oil-for-loans deal to give Venezuela's crisis-hit economy a break. So how bad have things got in Venezuela, and how hard-hitting are the new powers introduced under the state of emergency? And is China taking on too much risk as it shores up the investment over there? To talk about these and others, I'm joined in the studio by Mr. Harvey Zodian, a China Daily columnist, and Mr. Wang Peng, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. But first, let's take a look at this report.
Tear gas in the center of Caracas. Protesters, angry at delays in a recall referendum, wanted to march on the nation's electoral offices. They were prevented. Perhaps dangerously for the government here, these protests are becoming a vent for wider public discontent in the midst of a calamitous recession. They're being led by Enrique Capriles, state governor and former presidential candidate. On the eve of the opposition march, he gave the Venezuelan army, which has pledged allegiance to the government, a grave warning.
The moment of truth is coming to decide if you are with the Constitution or you are with Maduro. This is a decision that the army will be responsible for making.
With the bad news piling on President Maduro, he's declared a nationwide state of emergency. One respected opinion poll reports that almost 70% of Venezuelans want him to leave office this year. He has an answer to that.
I said in January, I said in February, I said in April, and I am saying in May. None of the options announced by the right to end the revolution and to overthrow me has political or historical viability. None will succeed.
The dire state of the Venezuelan economy is perhaps the president's biggest threat. A crash in global oil prices has unmasked its fundamental weakness. Now all basics are in short supply, and the country faces the risk of default later in the year. One way that possibly can be avoided is if China's multi-billion-dollar loans to Venezuela, which are repaid in oil, are rescheduled. Venezuela's new economic czar says a deal with China has been agreed.
They have been quite receptive to the proposal, and today we can say that we've agreed to new commercial conditions that are adapted to the country's reality.
That actually hasn't been formally confirmed by China. It says discussions are ongoing.
Considering the current international oil price changes, the two sides have agreed to discuss the flexible and effective methods of improving the financial cooperation mechanism between the two countries on the basis of mutual benefits.
Any relief from the immediate economic problem will be, of course, welcomed by the government, because the pressure from many other sides here is increasing. Stephen Gibbs, CCTV, Caracas.
As we have just heard, President Maduro has announced a 60-day emergency, giving soldiers and police much more power to maintain order in his country, which has been suffering huge economic crises. Do you think this crisis is more a political crisis, an economic crisis, Mr. Wang?
I think first it's a kind of economic crisis. So this country has fallen into economic recession in 2014, and in 2015, the economy shrinked for almost 7%. Right now, the commodity boom has been ended, so the oil prices continued to fall very sharply and quickly. This country is heavily dependent on oil income. So right now, this big drop of oil prices means the cash flow to this country is much less than before. So the country, the government, the Maduro government, it's very hard for it to gather financial resources to support its economic and social policies. So right now, you can see this in this country. Actually, in China, there are a lot of reports on the economic crisis in this country. Widespread shortage of daily goods, including medicine and food. People have to spend a lot of time, queue up to buy something important to their life. So, of course, it's also a kind of politically, it's a kind of political crisis. This mismanagement of the economy is obvious. So the Maduro government is facing criticism from people.
Harvey, how bad do you think it is in Venezuela?
I think it's at a critical point. I mean, you look at Venezuela, they have over 180% inflation now. The IMF forecasts that for this year, the inflation rate will be 720%, and for next year, an astounding 2,200%. So you look at all the suffering that's taking place now, the fact that people are dying for lack of medicine, that they don't have basic foods, and multiply that by a significant factor, and it's just bound to get worse. And you compound that with the fact that you had a very dynamic president in Hugo Chavez, who was a great actor, but maybe not the best leader. But right now you have a president who's a former bus driver, who I think is probably better qualified as a bus driver than as president of the country. And the country seems like it's leaderless, like it's moving in an unknown direction.
But some say it is actually Hugo Chavez's creation of this economic crisis, because he has been building too much thing, doling out too much goods to his people. What do you think?
I think that's probably true. When the times were good, when oil was very high priced, they could do all the many social renovations that they did, and they accomplished a lot. Oil accounts for 95 to 96% of Venezuela's exports, but they had a philosophy of putting all their eggs in one barrel. And so they only depended on oil, and they didn't diversify. I think this was their big mistake, and I think they've dug themselves into a big hole, and it's going to be very difficult to dig themselves out.
It's still a problem of mismanagement of its economy that Venezuela has been brought into this kind of a crisis.
Yeah, I think so. It's quite a kind of reason to explain what's happening to this country. This government, or the ruling party, it came into power in 1998. The ex-president Hugo Chavez, he's a very, very, very charismatic political leader in this region. So this guy really wants to change this country, to reform this country in order to resolve all the major social problems lasted for almost 100 years or 200 years.
But do you think his policies were right, or we should blame his policies for what is happening now?
Yeah, okay. He has too much ambition to reform this country. So, but I think it's impossible for a political leader to finish all those tasks within a short period. So sometimes, for me, in my opinion, this government or this ruling party is too radical. Sometimes their policies are really against economic reason. So,
and do you think, Harvey, if Hugo Chavez was alive, can he turn things around? Because of his charisma, because of his wherewithals, and
maybe not now. Although I think he could control the people better. I think the big problem was that they didn't put aside money for a rainy day, or a day when things might not be so good in the oil market. And so it was have a good time and worry about mañana, tomorrow. And so I think even Hugo Chavez would have a difficult time now controlling this situation.
I think that's why Mr. Maduro has been very steadfast in pushing more aggressive measures, like asking those factories to keep open, to have very stringent control of prices and everything. Do you think these kind of economic policies will hold?
But I think the problem now with forcefully opening up those factories or putting the factory owners in jail is not going to work. Why? A lot of the factories closed because they couldn't make money. Venezuela has many price controls. So because of these price controls, they can't make a profit. And why should they operate if they are going to just lose money? So many of them can't get the raw materials. The biggest company that's closed down is a beverage and brewing company. They can't get the hops to make the beer. So they close down. So if you open them up, they still can't make beer.
But Mr. Maduro blamed foreign powers for taking part in aggressive political and economic meddling of his domestic politics. He accused the United States of leading a ploy to change what is happening in Venezuela. Do you think he has grounds to blame others for what is a mess in Venezuela now?
Yeah, actually, I don't think so. You know, the United States is such a big guy. It's such a big neighbor of Venezuela. I think this country is always influencing the Venezuelan affairs. But right now, I don't think United States is really involved into this any intervention plot. But anyway, this country, Venezuela, is facing a very complex regional context. I think right now, the United States is doing something, is trying to isolate Venezuela in regional affairs. So the United States has normalized its relation with Cuba. It has, the President Obama has visited Argentina in order to enhance bilateral relations. On the other hand, the United States has extended its sanction against Venezuela in this March. So I think right now the United States is taking a very tough position towards Venezuela.
But according to Mr. Maduro, he saw some ploy of right-wing forces that is colluding together against the socialist government. That is happening in South America countries. He even compared to the president of Brazil's coming down as a coup. What is happening is similar. Do you think he has reasons to make that comparison?
I think the Venezuelan government, starting with Hugo Chavez and
continuing
into Maduro, have always used America or right-wing leaders in other countries as a foil, as a scapegoat. And so, yeah, maybe some of them are interfering. Of course they're interfering. But I think the problem is at home. It's not being created from abroad. And I think the situation is much different now than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago, for America anyway. Why? Because 10 or 15 years ago, America was much more dependent on oil. Now, America is much more self-sufficient on oil, so it doesn't matter as much. Yes, on the political level, America still remembers when President Chavez was at the UN in 2006 and called President Bush the devil, and that you could still smell the sulfur. So Americans don't like that, and they don't like that brand of government. But I don't think that on a political, economic level, it's that much concern.
But what will happen to Mr. Maduro politically? There is a recall referendum to end his presidency, and there is also a call for change to the Constitution. Will that happen? Will Mr. Maduro stay in office?
The vice president says no. There's a very complicated procedure for recall, and already for the recall petition, 1.8 million people have signed the petition. But the next round, 20% of the people have to sign. And then the next round after that, there's a very high bar for getting the president recalled. And if this doesn't occur by January of next year, the vice president will step in, even if Maduro is removed. So I don't think the government's going to let it go forward, and if they do, they're going to just change the hat from one president to a vice president, but it's the same failed policy.
What do you think will happen politically, Mr. Ma?
Yeah, I think the 1999 Constitution has this design for it's more like recall president. And this institution, this mechanism, I think it really works. You know, in 2004, there was a recall referendum, but Hugo Chavez, ex-president Hugo Chavez won this referendum. So, but later, I think there are some changes about the procedure to initiate this recall referendum. Right now, there are a lot of confusion among people about the procedures. So I think it will take quite a long time to really launch this recall referendum.
So most probably Mr. Maduro will stay until 2019.
I think so. I really think so. Anyway, the ruling party will remain in power for the next 3 years.
All right. You're now watching Dialogue. We're talking about what is going on in Venezuela and where it is heading. Don't go away. We'll be right back. You're now watching Dialogue. We're talking about political uncertainty and economic crisis in Venezuela. Well, there are around 200,000 Chinese working and living in Venezuela. They are in Caracas, in Valencia, and Puerto La Cruz. How would you characterize the relations between China and Venezuela? Obviously has the largest oil reserve in this world.
Yeah, right now I got some news report from Venezuelan media. There is a very large Chinese community. I suppose most of them are newcomers. They are from South China, especially Guangdong province. So it's a very increasing and very large Chinese community. But compared to other Latin American countries, this community is still small, especially compared to Peru and Brazil. So historically, I don't think
What do they do in Venezuela? What businesses are they in?
I think generally they run business like restaurants, supermarkets, most like that.
And of course, the economic relations between China and Venezuela largely depend on energy cooperation. There are a lot of energy deals between the two. Will the economic crisis happening in Venezuela change that kind of a cooperation mechanism?
Basically, I don't think so. I think the cooperation between China and Venezuela is very strategic. It's a kind of strategic partnership. As we know, Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world, and China is the largest oil importer in the world. So they have this common demand for cooperation. On the other hand, China has credit, China has technology, so those things are really needed by Venezuela. So I think right now, yes, there are some risks for this cooperation, but in long terms, I think this cooperation will have a quite good prospect.
Harvey, as you mentioned, there's a huge shortage of everything in Venezuela, and China is a big creditor to Venezuela. What do you think China should do, and what do you think China shouldn't do at this moment?
Well, this is a good news, bad news story, I think. China has lent, by some estimates, $60 billion to Venezuela, by other estimates, $50 billion, but still we're talking about a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so some people feel that that money may go down the tubes. I don't think so, because we're talking about oil. We're not necessarily talking about money. So I think actually China's renegotiated with Venezuela the terms of some agreements now, and I think it'll be good for both sides, because Venezuela can get some infusions of, as it's been called, in oxygen, some breathing room, and China can have assurance of more oil. The bad news side of this, however, to me, is that China has been enabling this terrible situation in Venezuela, this government that denies its people basic food supplies and medicine, with children dying in hospitals and so on. And even though China has the policy of non-interference and non-intervention in other countries' internal affairs, I think that they've been an enabler of a very bad situation.
And do you think China should do anything about helping Venezuela economy better diversify, deliver more public good in a rational way? Can China do anything on that front?
Yes, I think China has done something. For example, I think there is a kind of renegotiation of terms of Venezuela, the repayment to China's loan. So actually, Venezuela, I think right now, is enjoying better terms of repayment. So we know Venezuela is short of cash. So China is still continues to give some loan to this country. help it get some cash in order to pay for everything. So I think that's the best favor from China to Venezuela.
And also, it is strategic. Sometimes we say a friend in need is a friend indeed. Maybe this is a good time for China to have some deals with Venezuela to win the trust and have a strategic advantage.
Yes, I think so. This cooperation based on oil is also economic and it's also political. So right now, China has to face some risks from this cooperation. It needs time to overcome those risks. So we have to be patient.
And how deep a trouble is Venezuela in economically? Do you think the country can pull it through this time with the help of with the help from China and Belarus and other friendly countries?
I think the jury's still out on that for several reasons. Number one, many people are now demonstrating in the streets. Tear gas has been used. Estimates are that maybe up to a third of the people support President Maduro, so that leaves 2/3 who aren't enamored of him. If push comes to shove and there's a civil war or something like that, I think it'll be very difficult for Venezuela to honor its obligations. However, if things stay moderately under control, they're still going to have a difficult time, but might be able to squeak through with China's help.
Because the opposition leader, Enrique Capriles, has been urging the army to choose sides, either with the constitution or with the president. So the military stance is very important. What do you think the military going to do if the situation worsens on the streets?
I think going to the military is a little bit of playing with fire. I think it's true that President Chavez and President Maduro have changed the leadership of the military to be more in sync with the ruling party and the government. But you never know, because if you see this great dissatisfaction in the country, I think anything's possible. So I really worry about this spiraling out of control.
Do you think Mr. Maduro can still sit on top of this? Because, as Harvey mentioned, the military is probably still be siding with the president at this moment.
Yeah, I think so. You know, Hugo Chavez is from the military, so the ruling party has a quite close relationship with the military. And the high-ranking officials are quite sided with the government. And I think there is another factor to decrease the possibility of a military coup. Right now in Latin America, I think there is a general tendency against military coup, especially a military coup supported by the United States. So that's why, that's what happened in 2002. There was a military coup in Venezuela.
And the Venezuelan people are not in the mood of supporting a military coup.
Yes, I don't think they are really in sympathy with any military intervention. I think there is a very good constitutional solution to those political conflicts. So there is recall referendum. If the recall referendum was not launched, there will be another presidential election in 2008. So all those elections, all those democratic institutions, basically, I think they work. They work.
And what kind of pain are now the Venezuelans suffering? And what kind of breathing room do they have, do you think, at this moment, Harvey?
Well, to me, it looks very much like the Soviet Union looked in the, let's say, 70s or 80s, when people found out that a shop had some commodity like potatoes or apples or something like that. People would rush there. But this is the situation in Venezuela now, because there are so few goods. And I read a story about an owner of a factory who was in trouble because under his contract with the union, he had to supply toilet paper to his factory. But there was none, so he went on the black market and bought the toilet paper to keep his workers happy, and the government came in and accused him of dealing on the black market. So I think this is the kind of conundrum that's being faced. I think the situation is very dire.
Do you think Mr. Maduro realized this cannot last long? It has to stop total reliance on imports for its economy. Do you think Mr. Maduro will come up with any kind of economic policy to change what the current situation?
Right now, I think there is a very small space for the Maduro government to do it. But at the very beginning, the Hugo Chavez government really wanted to do it to diversify its economy. So according to the statistics,
Mr. Chavez lost a window of opportunity, you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. There is a quite good opportunity in 2006, 2007. Right? At that time, the economy of Venezuela was more diversified.
So what about now? Reset the economic structure. What are going to be the authority be doing about its economy? Cannot let this run its course?
Right now, I think it's really hard. This country needs financial resources from the oil. But right now, the oil industry is declining. The oil production is decreasing. The oil exporting is decreasing. So the government needs money to diversify its economy.
But other countries, oil-producing countries, are facing the same situation. Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia are also facing declining oil prices, and they are hanging on.
Well, not only hanging on, they're making plans for the future. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, and they've decided that their future is not in oil, but it's in other manufacturing and other goods and services.
Why can't Venezuela follow the suit?
Because they're up against the wall. They're in such an extreme position with 95 or 96% of their exports in oil. They don't have anything else. It's a desperation situation. It's very difficult to maneuver.
Do you think other South American countries and even the United States will do anything about this? Because watching a country on its doorstep going into mess, going to turmoil is not a good thing, of course.
Yes. I think that China will take the same position on this issue. Right now, Venezuela is really in a dilemma. There is too much polarization between different political forces. So it's a really big question for me to answer. It's a stagnation in this country.
So we still have to wait another year for the politics to have an
And
answer.
also, I think one organization that could be very helpful in marshaling resources is the Organization of American States. But they've just come out with a letter to President Maduro, basically telling him that he's doing a terrible job, he's harming his people, and so they're not supportive either. So I think Venezuela is in a really tough situation now.
So finally, do you think in about 2 years, when another presidential election happens, Venezuela will have chances of coming back on their feet?
Yeah, I think this presidential election is a kind of political solution to the country's problems. A new government with a lot of legitimacy. Then it will start reform, maybe economic reform, to rebuild the economy. So what might happen is really hard to predict.
Briefly, Harvey?
Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, said it's hard to make predictions, especially when they're about the future. I think that this is, anything could happen if there's some kind of a revolt or civil war, that all bets are off. I can't see that far into the future.
All right. Thank you very much, Harvey, and thank you, Mr. Wang. And you've been watching Dialogue here on CCTV News. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.